Welcome back. Before the break, we talked about Morgan Tsvangirai's challenge in making Zimbabwe's new unity government work. If he and President Robert Mugabe can work together, they have enormous issues to overcome. Zimbabwe is in the grip of a cholera epidemic. More than 3,000 people have died and around 60,000 have been infected. The country's economy is in tatters with 90% of the population unemployed. There's also hyperinflation, which means prices double every day. The failed economy, along with a threat of violence and persecution, has forced thousands to flee their homeland. And this has created animosity towards Zimbabwean refugees, particularly in South Africa, where most have escaped to. 2008 saw a huge rise in xenophobic attacks on Zimbabwean nationals in South Africa. The unity government also needs to rebuild Zimbabwe's international relationships. Robert Mugabe has consistently blamed Britain's legacy for the country's economic turmoil. He's also failed to bow to pressure from other African leaders over his treatment of his own people. Still with us are our guests in Johannesburg, Socks Chikowera, who, despite the fact he's wearing a Mugabe shirt, it says Mugabe must go, so he's not one of his supporters. In London, George Sherry, and in Leeds, Lionel Cliff. Mr. Cliff, is it fair to say, well, I think it is fair to say, that he faces one of the toughest political assignments in the world, Morgan Tsvangirai? Hanging on to this success is the humanitarian situation in the country. How do you think this will be addressed so that everybody benefits?
Number one question, and this will be played out through what I consider a policy struggle, as well as personality struggle over the next months. There are some very immediate emergency needs in the health field, not only with cholera, but the need to begin to rebuild what used to be quite an effective health service system. There's a cholera epidemic, a treatable disease, precisely because there is a failure in the system. Recovery also means that the land, not only the land recently acquired from white farmers, but all land has to be made more productive. That means things like resuscitating the fertilizer industry, become a really crucial intervention immediately. These problems have got to be addressed, answers found, and resources devoted to them. And talking about resources inevitably means how is the rest of the world going to respond?
Mr. Sherry, the UN accused Mugabe of using food security as a weapon when he cut off aid from NGOs in June 2008. Will he do the same now, or will there be some sort of even distribution throughout the country?
I mean, I take umbrage in two ways. In which the question is framed as if I have something to defend or not. I want to analyze situations.
No, I'm just asking you a question.
Part of just if I could, Wes, I know the question is irrelevant because in a sense,
no, it's very relevant. This is a UN accusation accusing him of using food security, and people died as a result of that.
Then you have to ask the Zimbabwean government to answer that question, not me. I think it's the fair question to ask. The fair comment I'm making is the narrative that you use to make sense of Zimbabwe is faulty. And because the narrative you use to describe Zimbabwe is faulty, we fail to understand where we go from here. That's the question. The issue really in Zimbabwe, whether you're looking at the economic question, the economic survival or recovery of Zimbabwe is tied into the region. It's not an isolated Morgan Tsvangirai issue. And Morgan Tsvangirai will learn very quickly that he will have to work together with the rest of the cabinet for the rest of this deal to work.
A lesson that Robert Mugabe must also likely learn. I mean, at the same time, how does the economy recover then if you've got an unemployment rate of 96%? What do you think should be done to bring investment back into the country?
Again, I think it will recover as long as you remember that last year before, not only was SADC talking about how to resolve the political crisis, it was also talking about how to make the economic recovery. Within that package is the realignment of currencies within the region. And we're going to see much more activity around that. And in many ways, I would argue that ZANU-PF occupies the higher ground within that discussion, as opposed to the one-off remarks people are making. Hence my concern about how you introduce people to understand the nature of the crisis is quite important. Of course, everybody, both the MDC and ZANU-PF, face a challenge to get things to work. But really, it's not up to Morgan Tsvangirai, let alone Robert Mugabe, to see it through. It's rather Zimbabwean political classes coming together, seeing what are the national interests, how do they relate to the regional picture, and how they relate to the geopolitical picture. And in that context, I even to think really it's MDC who have to rethink what they think their political project will be.
Mr Tsvangirai, to try and bring further investment into the country, there's a lot of debate about what should be done regarding the sanctions imposed on most of those who've worked alongside Robert Mugabe. Do you think that these sanctions should be lifted, or should they be lifted on the condition of change in the country?
Firstly, I would want to differ with my comrade who was just speaking to say it is the MDC who must rethink in order for this thing to work. Instead, it's ZANU-PF which must rethink, because if ZANU-PF is going to continue to rule the way they were ruling for the past 20 years and impose that, or maybe teach the MDC that this is how we rule, really we won't go anywhere. But in any case, if we talk in terms of the sanctions, I don't remember any sanctions which are being imposed on the government of Zimbabwe. I don't remember one. All the sanctions I remember are the targeted sanctions, smart sanctions on individuals of the ZANU-PF government and companies aligned to it, the companies which made that government survive in order for it to kill, rape, steal elections to the point of stealing the deal. So I don't see how it affects the government. If I'm targeted, if the sanctions are imposed on SOCs as SOCs, I don't see them affecting the government. What I can only say is the international community, whoever is concerned, must now open their doors to this government which is there now, and help them out, because it's the government which deals with the grassroots, with the general population of the country. So in terms of the sanctions, those who are being targeted, let them stay there, and those who are directed to the government, let them be lifted.
I think I need to intervene very quickly. First of all, I welcome the moment which Morgan Tsvangirai goes internationally and asks the United States to remove the Zimbabwe Democracy Act, which precludes Zimbabwe having access to foreign currency. Those are sanctions. No, you can't put it in any other way. Secondly, the political classes in Zimbabwe are also they're also the business class. If you restrict the movement of people with access to capital, indirectly it affects businesses. The numbers of companies that have been listed in EU are businesses that employ people. That affects individuals. Those sanctions should go, whether you call them smart or targeted,
can I just interject that most of the sanctions, the EU,
Secondly,
the UN sanctions, targeted Robert Mugabe and his regime.
Just one small piece. You know, it really would be fair if you don't interrupt when I'm in floor. The first and last thing I want to say, you know, there is a difference between the ideological terrain and how to rule. I was talking about the ideological political terrain that the MDC has to think with. And that is a very serious, important question for them. How to rule is another question. That's administrative. That is not about what the crisis is about. The crisis in Zimbabwe and in the region are two political, ideological terrains.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt, but only because we're running out of time. Because we're running out of time, so do forgive me, but I would like to give Mr. Cliff the final word here. We have got a humanitarian crisis brewing. This is still going to take a long time to be resolved while this political deadlock, this impasse, or whatever you want to call it, continues. Do you think that the credibility of Africa's failed diplomacy in resolving this issue overshadowed the humanitarian situation, overshadowed the saving of people's lives?
No, I don't think it's a total failure. Not that it's an enormous success, but there wouldn't be even this agreement without certain interventions from SADC and the region as a whole. This is going to continue to be important in the monitoring of the agreement. But there's also a challenge not only for the region but internationally. Whether there is or hasn't been in the past something we could call sanctions, what is true is that the international community, the West particularly, has signaled that they are ready to make some kind of support for a recovery program, but this is going to be conditional on the success of the agreement and political reform, but also implying success in institutionalizing economic reform. And this makes me somewhat worried, because economic reform, if it were to mean complete deregulation, complete privatization of the economy, would not be the answer to the needs of recovery, and especially not appropriate in this moment of international global crisis where deregulation is not the answer to so many problems.
And of course, the man in charge of the economy, Tendai Biti, arch enemy of Robert Mugabe. Interesting times. Gentlemen, thank you very much for talking to us. Lionel Cliff in Leeds, George Sherry in London, and Sox Chikawere in Johannesburg, both from Zimbabwe. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and your suggestions. As always, you can email us at aljazeera.net/English. Goodbye for now.